In cybersecurity, there are no borders. You can't say it stops here in Germany or it stops here in America. Rather, it is something global. And I see this with our customers too, is this zero trust approach, which to me is just bullshit bingo.
It's really about time that digitalization first leads to action and not just announcements.
We need to think more about. We see, particularly in Ukraine, that a drone operates on a completely different level compared to the traditional warfare we had without drones.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Shall Be Sea-Level Priority, the podcast that puts the digital world to the test. Cyber attacks are on the rise, and data is the most valuable asset in today's world. But how can we protect what matters most to us? Drawing on the latest insights, effective strategies, and practical tools, we'll show you how to create a more secure digital environment. Because one thing is clear: security isn't negotiable. It's a top priority.
Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Cybersecurity Chef Sache, the podcast. Today with a very special episode because beforehand we tried to organize some appointments, plan some things. Of course, it's also difficult when you live on the other side of the continent, but I'm all the more pleased that we have now found the time to record with you, Robert. A warm welcome, Robert.
Hello, I'm pleased.
For everyone who doesn't know you yet and is wondering why it was so difficult, maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself, who you are, and especially what I mean by the other side of the continent.
With pleasure. So currently I live and work quite close to DC, when you consider it by American standards. Also Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world. The background is that I am a naval officer, and you can probably hear it from my accent, a Franconian in the Navy. That's how things sometimes develop. How did the path lead there? And why did it also go more in the cyber direction? In parallel, well, in my childhood, I already had the good old bread box. At some point, I got the Commodore 64 and then found my love for IT and hacking. And but somehow the decision came, okay, I'm going to join the Navy. For whatever reason, it was quite exciting. I then studied computer science at the Bundeswehr in Munich, and then various trainings afterwards. I became a command and control technology officer, and a ship electronics officer on board ships and was involved in various missions. And then I stayed in the Bundeswehr, but with the intention of returning to university. Okay, I then did my dissertation in the field of cybersecurity, intrusion detection, and then continued that in subsequent roles, let's say in parallel, with many long weekends and long nights. I also completed my habilitation in that field, and I'm active in teaching and research. And then we had the fortune a few years ago to establish the cyber and information space in the Bundeswehr, which is now its own branch of the armed forces, so that we can also contribute well. And I had various roles there. There were some really great things involved. One thing that was really fun was setting up penetration testing in the Bundeswehr as a completely new function where I could handpick my own students, who then accordingly joined the new department, then came in. And there we didn't just work on software, but it really progressed. We quickly moved to firmware down to the hardware level. So it was a really great time. But now I'm a general staff officer, so things move quickly. The next role was then at the ministry, also a very exciting time. Then, of course, it went from the electron level all the way up to the strategic level. And during that time, we had the IT Security Act 2.0, among other things. Or also the cybersecurity strategy for Germany, where the military part was on my desk. And I had to coordinate the work from all the departments and offices and align with the other ministries. What's exciting is when you have to agree on individual sentences for weeks until everyone is satisfied with the wording. A highly exciting job. It was also a lot of fun. And then it moved on again, and that was over to the other side of the pond. To the States, to NATO, ACT, Allied Command Transformation. I was initially a section head in the area called interoperability, verification and validation, a somewhat more complex term. Essentially, it's about the fact that we now have 32 nations. I hope it stays that way, and a lot of different equipment, and they naturally have to work together. And just because they are built to the same standard doesn't mean it works in practice. So it has to be tested. There is a large exercise once a year. It takes place in Poland in Bydgoszcz called the Civics. I was initially the director for that. That was a lot of fun. And then I had the opportunity about a year and a half ago to take over CyberEnact. And now I'm back, let's say, back to the roots. And it is in matters for NATO. I mean, for example, the capabilities, systems that the community jointly finances and then makes available to NATO and the nations. That's a bit of the background. And that's why we are now operating here with a 6-hour time difference. And that has made the times very intense, making scheduling a bit more difficult as well.
I'm incredibly excited because we already talked about so many things in the preliminary conversation. And as it personally concerns me, I also find it great that despite your, let's say, position, you also just so willingly share your knowledge with Giebstays. I also got to know you through LinkedIn. Then I later realized that some people, both former colleagues of mine, have also served with you or are friends of those I know. So you can see for yourself. In the Bundeswehr, the cyber world is actually quite small and everyone somehow knows each other. And I found it especially fascinating how this career path developed from the Navy, where you don't really talk about cyber. Although that's actually incorrect because I specifically come from the OT sector. And I naturally think that maritime security also has a lot to do with cyber, because a warship, a submarine, or whatever contains a lot of technology, and one should definitely consider that. Think about how I can protect such technology against cyber attacks.
Definitely, the systems have become increasingly complex. And I would say we even have a complete strategic evolution. And especially when we look at the new mega constellations, functionalities like direct-to-cell as Starlink and others are doing, yes, also other attackers. To advance, just imagine. Then I have worldwide, and this also includes the seas. The possibility with my regular phone. Direct a 5G connection via a satellite. So like when we had DIH 3.0 back then, it was complete nonsense. Oh, the satellite failed and such nonsense. But with this, it actually becomes a reality. And of course, it has many security implications. At the time when I was a ship electronics officer, it was still common practice to send emails twice a day without attachments. That is, of course, absolutely outdated now. And such things are then also demanded. And with that, you quickly have mobile connections everywhere all of a sudden. And you practically have a much better localization capability. Of course, you also have that. Additionally, simply projecting the 5G standards into the non-terrestrial networks naturally opens up a whole bunch of new cybersecurity challenges and vulnerabilities. Therefore, things are changing just because of that, but also the OT with the increasing connectivity, whether it's better maintenance here and better coordination with all the data collection, like in all areas, also in the economy, everything is more interconnected. And often, yes, from the development perspective, security is not considered from the beginning, considered, and the corresponding challenges then arise.
A little birdie also told me it was the same in the Navy. Especially when you're out at sea, you get a bit bored. And there was a Robert who did things out at sea to see how it works. I believe that was certainly part of why you ended up in the cyber direction, because like me, you started questioning early on how things work and what you can do with them. And I think I still see that today. Again and again, it's the entry point into the cyber world for many people. Because as a child, you might have received something. I've often mentioned in the podcast that for me, it started when my parents installed some kind of child protection in the browser. Back then, it was the AOL browser. And I was always really annoyed that I couldn't access the internet. Until one day, the idea came to me to just install another browser so I wouldn't be under the AOL browser's child protection anymore, or at school where we had OpenSUSE. And our school administrator was tinkering with us all the time, trying to figure out how to make the system secure. And one day we conducted a penetration test and found out during the test that all the passwords in OpenSUSE were processed in plain text back then. And in the end, we had the password of every teacher or student from the school. So it's sometimes super exciting to see how things develop. But now we've actually strayed from the main topic, but I'm glad we talked about it. Today, we want to talk about geopolitical crises and especially the impacts, particularly in cyberspace, and also for you in your work to some extent in hybrid warfare. Before we perhaps start with that, let's talk about what geopolitical crises actually are. For me, it's very clear in the current times. The topic of the Ukraine conflict. For me, that's one of the biggest challenges we currently face, which we keep dealing with. And then there's always the topic of the Middle East. And what you also keep hearing about, which is still not very tangible for many, is the issue in the South China Sea, which is also related to our chip manufacturing and additional components that we all need for electronics, because there are also the largest centers where such things are produced. What is your opinion on geopolitical crises?
I would categorize it exactly like that. Exactly these three examples, because they also have a corresponding global significance. If you look, we have a brutal number of crises, even when you look into Africa, what is happening there on a daily basis, how the influences are changing, especially how the influence of Western nations has almost completely disappeared in recent years, while China and Russia have made significant inroads. Left a mark. There is a lot happening which remains somewhat local, although today you never know how quickly it can develop. But for the typical examples where we are now, of course, feeling the effects worldwide up close, Ukraine is at the forefront. No question. The situation in the South China Sea is also escalating further. I am following it here. From the press, of course, probably a bit differently than in Germany. There is probably a bit more coverage than in Europe because it is a very central issue for the USA. And when you see how the aggression is also increasing there, how the measures are being pushed forward more and more on a daily basis, definitely something to watch with concern. And when you consider Taiwan with the significance of the chip manufacturers, it's one of the top issues. And when you look at it, for example, yes, of course, we all have the attempt, which we will probably get to in a moment, to become more independent. When you look at chip factories and such, it works more or less well. The Americans have also set up a very comprehensive program with their chips. It's also doing quite well. So these are investments in the hundreds of billions. And I don't really know. I looked it up once. Something like 100 new chip factories are being built or expanded. So great. But if you look into the details, you see that the top state-of-the-art plants that can build 2 nanometers remain in Taiwan. So 7 nanometers and up are coming to the States, and it doesn't look any different in Europe. And therefore, it naturally has a significant impact on further development if things were to become really critical there. And then, of course, the Middle East with the ongoing war there for quite some time now, and also here. Think about one or another supply chain incident, you immediately see the global implications it has. So I would categorize it the same way, and these are the significant examples.
What I always notice with geopolitical crises is that they are also shifting significantly, especially as you mentioned, for example, the South China Sea. There is a very strong confrontation between, let's say, the Coast Guard and the military on both sides. There, it is still very centralized in terms of physical attack or physical provocation. On the other hand, you just gave the example of chip manufacturers and so on. I also see this repeatedly. Manipulation in cyber. And I believe this is also a topic that has changed significantly in recent years. And we also see in other crisis areas that we no longer need to be on site to harm the other, or rather to provoke there as well, but rather that much also happens through cyberspace. And I believe that there is just a completely different possibility has emerged, because you no longer have to send people, you don't have to send boats, you don't have to send the military, but you can do everything, I would say, literally at the push of a button from your home. And that also shows you how important it is to do more in this cyberspace, especially internationally, because I also see the topic here repeatedly. Many also always say that we are in this hybrid warfare, that one part happens virtually and the other still happens on the battlefield. What is your view on this? Do you believe that it will shift more into the virtual realm? Or do you think we will continue to see, I would say, the aggression? That it will still happen physically?
Well, I actually see the central challenge for us as Western countries with freedom of expression and everything. Yes, how do we continue to deal with social media, with fake news, etc. around, especially because the quality is advancing rapidly. Sure, there are detection mechanisms, etc., but it is a cat and mouse game, and you always have such a short time interval only where you can try to counter fake news, because once they are out, they take hold. And if you try to retract them 2 or 3 days later, no one reads it anymore. No one is interested. You don't reach the people. And that is, of course, like the keyword Network Enforcement Act or such things, a real problem for us. Yes, how do we actually want to approach this now? Make pre-filters or something else? Well, the US is deregulating endlessly now. And if you then look at who, in which positions, how they act, it's also a bit difficult for Western societies. So that worries me, but I also particularly see the importance of cyber. Let's say sometimes I have the feeling whether the lessons learned from Ukraine are being done correctly, because there is always the analysis, okay, we haven't seen any, in quotes, no major cyber activities. Of course, a lot is happening in the information space and regarding data destruction and so on, but not what some expected at the beginning. Okay, Russia is now going to just shut down the entire power supply and so on. There were individual examples where they tried and it went wrong. It's clear if I just slightly modify malware that's 5 years old and then tries it, then it's a grab for low-hanging fruits. If it had worked, then it would have been...
Yes, with WannaCry it did work. If you look at it, it was similar. Well, I don't want to say similar, but it was also the case that the vulnerability was known for ages, but still hardly anyone patched it. And then WannaCry suddenly came like a hammer over everyone, even though the quality of the programming was more on a script kiddie level.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's a great example, because in the discussion, the NSA was often blamed. Well, they exploited the vulnerability for 5 years. And so, but actually the patches were available and just weren't applied, or many legacy systems. And that's again the issue of the complexity of our networks and systems. And that's the main difficulty. And then also the differences in structure. When I look at Ukraine, they have, of course, learned a lot since 2014 and have built their systems significantly more resilient. There is also more, let's say, old technology in there that I can then control manually. Then I compare that with the grid here, with our synchronous grid of Europe, which of course runs very stably overall, but faces major challenges, especially with the transition to renewable energies and so on, lacking cold start capability. And these things are becoming increasingly unstable. And there have been quite a few reports recently, such as tons of photovoltaic systems being controlled from the cloud in China. And if you look at it, the reserve is just 3 gigawatts that are in the entire grid. And what all the systems deliver, if I exploit that cleanly as an attacker, I have excellent opportunities to generate physical effects with drastic consequences from cyberspace. And I always caution a bit about this. We need to think more about it, because if we ever face a confrontation with Russia, then we need to be prepared for something like this. Then it won't remain as it was in Ukraine. Quite simply because the situation, the infrastructure, and the framework conditions are entirely different.
I find that an interesting example because it reminds me of a topic. Before the COVID-19 crisis, I had a lot to do with Israeli companies, which, as you know, are state-of-the-art in the cybersecurity field. So there are also companies coming from there that you've heard of, which have now developed the state Trojan, and so on. So there's a lot happening in the cyber realm. And I once actually had the honor to speak with the person responsible at the time for this cyber program in Israel. And I once asked him a question, and then he said, look, why do you invest so much money in training many people who, at the end of their military careers, go back into the free market, develop startups, and earn millions? What do you gain from that? And then he says, such a typical German. You always think about it the wrong way. I always think of it like this. I invest a sum X in my country. Because these people, they gain the knowledge, they build this knowledge, they protect my country. Why, I'll explain in a moment. And afterwards, they further develop the technologies, expand their knowledge, and create a company with it. And this company will definitely also support my country if case X should happen or day X comes, regardless of whether it now has a new company or not. That means I invest in a very good education with Ashish, which is what I always say we need to do better here in Europe. We need to invest more in education, including in terms of cybersecurity. And by that, I don't mean this classic topic of media literacy, right? There's always talk about media literacy in schools. Yes, WhatsApp is evil and LinkedIn is evil and Facebook is evil and so on. But I always say, folks, that's not the right approach. Instead, you have to create awareness. How do I deal with these things? What does it mean when I use such things? And just move away from these classic things in schools. Computer science. Now I'm learning HTML and CSS. But to get back to what I meant, he also told me we have the problem, we have no allies. Of course, we have allies who help us repeatedly, whether it's the USA or other areas. They can only help us by, for example, placing a ship in front of our country and assisting, so to speak, in attacks with missiles. But the attacks happen very much in cyberspace, because if you cut off their power supply, they have no way to get help. They have been planning for years to lay undersea cables to Cyprus to become more independent from their own production. But at the end of the day, and he told me this quite specifically, we have the problem that we are heavily attacked in cyberspace because it is the easiest way to harm us compared to launching a physical attack, since we have already invested very well in our military. They have already seen that. That was indeed a few years ago. For them, the focus has always been there for several years. The cyber.
Yes. They have been doing that systematically very well for a long time. It was also evident that the recruitment priority was indeed on cyber. So even before the Air Force and other areas, people were identified. And especially, as you mentioned, with the startups, there are many there as well that emerged, which then precisely reflect the needs of the military. Therefore, it is truly a great win-win situation. Yes, that's true. It is done excellently, and in this difficult geopolitical situation where Israel finds itself, they are doing it very purposefully. I also find the research there, for example, from Ben Gurion University, so great. We have our own department that is focused on or has specialized in how can I bypass the air gap. So when you think of Stuxnet again, okay, how do I get my malware more into the target system if it is not connected to the internet? And they have come up with really, really great things over the years. Or also, how can I, for example, just to name an example because it's so great, how can I eavesdrop on a room by observing the intensity changes of a light source from the pan, and so on. So all of this is technically, let's say much of it is in the lab. On a larger scale, it's always a bit more difficult. You have to see what can be implemented. We are doing really great research and it's all very targeted. And also the way we've gotten a bit better at that, definitely in recent years, how we need to deal with startups. They have been doing that excellently for years. There is a cyber fair, a huge area just for the startups. Legal advice is also included for them right there. Hey, what do you need to do? How can we support you? And this holistic thinking, I always find it a bit lacking in Germany. There you are pretty much on your own. Meanwhile, at the University of the Bundeswehr, for example, we also have appropriate support for startups. Unfortunately, that didn't exist in my time. Otherwise, I might have ventured out with something similar and we would be better. But there's still a lot of room for improvement. And we need to build up speed there.
You also brought up an important example earlier. I would like to elaborate on that again. You also talked about fake news. And how I became aware of you back then was through the article where you reported on the issue with the Hezbollah pages. And I found it very impressive again. And I see that repeatedly. Especially when we talk about cyber, it's always quickly mentioned, whether in politics, in business, or even in the private sector, there's always immediate talk of a hack. So 90% of the reports I hear from friends are, oh, I've been hacked. Oh, I have this and I have that. And then I always say, folks, let's just talk about what actually happened. And then it usually turns out, no, it wasn't a hack at all. It was simply a bad password. Or it was just a lack of attention, whatever it may be. And back then, during the spoiler hack, you communicated very clearly because all the media jumped on it and said, oh no, the pages have been hacked. The pages were hacked in such a way that they exploded and so on. And then I questioned myself back then, okay, I know such a pager. I also know how big such a battery is. And then I saw a picture in parallel of what this pager had cost. And I said, with common sense, it couldn't have been just the battery. But all the media immediately focused on it back then and said it was the cyber attack. The things were hacked. And I find that super difficult, especially when we look at geopolitical crises. This classification, what really happened? And was it really a hack? Was it really an attack or whatever? And since cyberspace is somewhat like the cloud, like a cloud, and you never really know what's happening with it, I find it difficult to immediately form an opinion, especially from people who might not even have the technical know-how of what it looks like. And then I often see this insecurity towards cyberspace because it gets so blown up.
Absolutely. And the big challenge is when you immediately focus on such a topic. Yes, that's exactly how it was. You forget everything else around it. And the pagers and also the walkie-talkies, they are a prime example of that. When you calculate it, you quickly see, okay, battery is impossible. And when you look at the framework conditions, yes, even if I had actually implemented a battery with the field lighter, an impact, it would never work with such synchronization of so many devices in such a time frame, and so on. And you can immediately say, okay, a supply chain issue. And then it's also interesting again, yes, was it the battery itself or the entire device and so on? There was accordingly a lot of reporting, both better and worse. And then you have to put together the overall picture. Okay, how was it ignited then? Because if I now, for example, were to replace the battery, which in this case is not enough, then I could consider whether I need to additionally hack the device to send an appropriate signal to bring it to detonation. If I replace it completely, I can integrate it right away. And that's so important because the analysis of the root cause is somewhat behind it. Yes. Where do I really need to intervene now? What kind of threat is it and how can I improve it? And we see with the example, there were statements from Israel in that context as well, that you can basically do it with any arbitrary thing if you want to. There's a lot of power behind such a statement and something that should concern us. Because in principle, I can no longer trust my entire IT at all, which is where we are with this fundamental problem. And that reflects a bit deeper than this superficial discussion. For example, when you think, okay, yes, it's unfortunate now if the Intel plant doesn't come to Magdeburg, etc. On top of that, those who are networking, the IP rights on it, I don't know how the chip itself is structured, what exactly it does. So what should I compare it against? How am I supposed to detect if someone has tampered with it or installed a backdoor which isn't so obvious? With billions of gate functions, if I have a sort of reference model to compare against and a technology that does that for me. And so we have so many elements in the supply chain where we are extremely dependent, where one is a good attacker. Not everyone can do that, of course, but even there, the threshold is slowly lowering, where we face extreme challenges and where we don't adequately seize the opportunities we have on the other side. So I find a few EU projects great in this context. For example, the funding for high-performance RISC-V processors, an open source-based processor, all nicely available on the internet. However, it hasn't yet had the performance for many areas, and the EU has now gone ahead and not divided the funding program into 30 different things again, but specifically selected one area and then gave the entire requirement funding part to the consortium. And these are things where I have a bit of hope. On the other hand, I see, yes, we had companies that, for example, was it called Made in Germany, a RISC-V processor with an SEL4 Linux, so microkernel and so on, all hardened, all secured, specifically for the area of critical infrastructures. And so it didn't quite reach the people. And these are always the things, there's a lot available, but we don't use it, and we have the dependencies and the risks. Because of that, I believe we still haven't fully realized how significant it actually is today due to our dependencies on cyberspace, and we're still a bit naive in some areas.
But that's where zero trust comes into play. Our favorite buzzword. Zero trust solves all problems. No, just kidding. But I agree with you. So we have also become somewhat dependent in Europe, even when we look at security, which manufacturers are really out there. And yes, I don't want to bash anyone here. There are, of course, many manufacturers, but that also makes security products in Germany. But if we look at the big picture, then these are American companies, then there are companies from Israel, then there are companies from China. These are the ones that dominate the market. And I think this is, again, a topic that we need to consider in these geopolitical issues. We have found ourselves, as was evident during the Corona crisis and the Ukraine war, in a certain dependency on suppliers, producers, as we have already discussed, for example. Schizophrenia, which comes from Taiwan, where we have no chance to simply close this gap now. And I believe that's something we first need to address. Yes, we know we are in a dependency, and to some extent, we are currently in a state of shock. What are we going to do now? You mentioned the example, for instance, with Magdeburg. To my knowledge, the chip factory is no longer being built or only partially being built. So once again, we started big, we are doing something, and then suddenly it didn't work out again. The exact same thing happened back then in Kassel with the solar manufacturers, which were also made really big, really well established, and then the subsidies were taken away, causing the entire business to collapse. So you can see it everywhere, that you always have to think about it, especially geopolitically, where and with whom do I get involved? And I also always find it so wrong to say zero trust. For example, a simple example, when it all started with Huawei in Germany back then, I was working for a company at the time that sold Huawei, and then it was like, I was the head of cybersecurity back then, and I was asked, Nico, what do you think about Huawei at that time? There was this Bundestag debate at the time about whether Huawei could be used in the G sector or not, and so on and so forth. And I clearly took a stand back then and also received some information about it. How can you do something like that? But I clearly took a stand back then and said, folks, how do we know if the Chinese, the Americans, the Finns, there are dozens of manufacturers going, don't also have something in their software, in their system? We simply don't know. We also can't know. We can only know when something happens.
That's actually a great point, because let's say with China, unfortunately, we don't know as much through facts as we do with the States. Because with the States, the Snowden documents were very helpful back then, as were the Vault 7 leaks from the CIA, which were relatively overlooked in the press, but in terms of content and power were much greater, where you could see exactly which programs were being implemented. And of course, I also know a few companies in Germany where we found hardware implants in the routers. So it really is the case that you decide on one side, where will I incur the greater damage in the end? And right now, digital sovereignty and the geopolitical situation are actually the perfect keywords. If we look at how the USA is acting, under the current administration, the reliability of the partner is somewhat limited. You don't know what's coming, and that's where I have a problem. And I think we need to be a bit more honest about the term digital sovereignty, because it is used in quite an interesting way in Germany. For example, if I operate a Microsoft operating system in the cloud, and just because I get a glimpse of the source code of an update, that's not digital sovereignty.
Yes, and the other point I always make is that companies themselves are responsible. What I also see repeatedly, and I see this with our customers too, is this zero trust approach, which to me is just bullshit bingo. But I've talked about it often, so we don't need to elaborate on it again. It's all well and good, but in the end, it doesn't relieve me of my responsibility to think about whether I want to use manufacturer A throughout my entire company, or if I might want to use manufacturer A and then manufacturer B to have better transparency, and also to ensure operational reliability. And I often see this issue where people tend to side with the notion that they can't influence it anyway, because as you said, with one you know, with another you don't. Who knows what will change in the future, whether there will be kill switches or not? No one can foresee that. Then I'd rather take this path. Well, then that's just how it is, and I'll leave it at that instead of thinking about what I believe is the right way. This free life of defense, or the onion skin principle, as it's often called in Germany, is about thinking, okay, if I use such a manufacturer, how can I build something around it so that if something happens, I can intercept it? And for me, in this whole question of sovereignty, this is always the topic that is completely overlooked. It's always said that we need to do something with Germany. We need to develop such products in Germany. We need to do something, but we sometimes don't even have the fertile ground to develop anything because the location isn't lucrative. The personnel costs are too high. Such products also come with their price, or there's a lack of support, a lack of political will, and so on and so forth. These are all factors that need to be considered. And then, for me, it's the wrong approach to simply say, okay, yes, we as Germans need to do more, instead of saying, okay, we need to adapt to this situation now. In security, it's always like this. It's always called continuous improvement. I love this word, but in the end, it doesn't mean anything else. We constantly need to evaluate ourselves, constantly check if it's still the right path, and not just say, I'm giving up now because I can't change it anyway and it will somehow work out.
Exactly. Not everything is just getting worse. I always find it nice when it comes to the number of vulnerabilities where only the statistics are thrown out. And of course, it increases, but where is the development of the number of lines of code being considered? Even the year before last, if you calculated it, it actually decreased. Now it has risen a bit, but it's still a poor value. There are so many factors involved in whether the software is really getting worse, better, or how exactly it is changing. And we really need to focus on what we can actually do effectively in our situation. Mitigation, as you mentioned, is the best example, and I'd like to bring up Huawei again in this context. The discussion about whether there's something in it or not is difficult. And the transparency back then, Anil contributed a lot, used because it doesn't help me much if I can look at 13 million lines of source code.
You don't even know if they are the right ones. I didn't understand that discussion back then at all. When it was said that Huawei is making the code public, I said, well, and who says that's the code that's actually installed in the systems?
They can present any code, and what am I even expecting there? It's not like there's just some port open on 7777, as other manufacturers have done, but if I do it cleverly, I just have a few programming errors, and then I can exploit them accordingly. But I can plausibly deny it if someone accuses me, saying it's just a programming error, nothing more. And since I can't check that in the complexity of the devices, I have to consider, yes, how can I exploit it if I have it in there? Exactly as you say. And then I have to see, how is my system? Okay, if I install a backdoor accordingly, then I have to make sure it doesn't get out at the XYZ boundary. And if I have understood my architecture, then I can implement mitigation measures to prevent exploitation, even if it is present. And I often miss these discussions as well. A big problem, or like with zero trust, zero implicit trust, and there is still a lot of problem left in the network when I have implemented that. And we often don't think about this holistically.
What is also an exciting topic for me, and perhaps you can provide some insights on this, is when we talk about geopolitical crises. I say this on a small scale. In cybersecurity, there are no borders. You can't say it stops here in Germany or it stops here in America. Rather, it is something global. By the way, I initially misspoke about the continent. I mean, of course, you're across the pond. But aside from that, collaboration is super important. And that's also why I do this podcast, why I do a lot of public relations. Because from the very beginning, in the 12 years I've been in cybersecurity, I've always said we need to exchange more, we need to do more. And I've always had the problem that many didn't want to talk or share their knowledge because they said, no, then I'm vulnerable. If you have the knowledge, then someone else has it too. And no, that's not so good, and so on. That has changed in the meantime. So I've experienced that myself as well. But what I'm interested in is, how do you see this point also from a global perspective? How have NATO, the EU, and the German armed forces developed in the past in terms of building something together in this area? Because as I said, there are no borders. What can happen in Germany can just as easily happen in France or in America. How do you see it? Has the collaboration changed?
From my perspective, very positively. And again, it's a question of speed. In which area? So, for example, when it comes to purely technical matters, like exchanging indicators of compromise in near real time, the CRT network in Europe, which includes the EU, the German armed forces, and so on, this has been working very well for years. Internationally, the topic has also gained a very high level of importance by now. And NATO, as a current example, we're down, are in the process of developing the so-called Martin-Ohren NIC, the NATO Integrated Cyber Defense Center, which will start its initial functionality this year, although it will take a few years, and it will bring together various areas like the security centers of NATO. But a very important aspect is also incorporating the civilian components, such as trustworthy companies, etc. Because the main challenge for us from a military perspective is that 98% of cyber assets are in civilian hands, and you can't do anything without good cooperation. The commands year started years ago with the Cyber Reserve to better integrate people. And that is important to understand. The goal is not to bring people into the Bundeswehr in a crisis or wartime situation, taking them away from their jobs. No one gains from that. It doesn't help me if I send one of our people to telecom or a power plant because they don't know the system environment and everything else. The important thing is that trust has been established, that there is quick communication, and that you know who to call and what to do if such an incident really occurs. A lot has changed in recent years, and I see that very positively due to the overall complexity, especially in Germany now with the cybersecurity architecture of Germany. There is this framework. And then you have individual elements in there where I say, yes, the Cyber Defense Center is one of the central elements, which I find super important. And it is also developing. From my perception, because I have also worked with the ministry on the military side, it could be a bit faster. These are simply the right measures. The speed is still a bit of a problem, but fundamentally, I see the positive in its development.
What I can say about this, I always find that the main problem is the complexity of cyberspace. I'll give you a simple example. We had clients, a forensic incident, which we handled and of course also involved the state authorities. And the problem alone was who is responsible for the report now. We had a client located near Stuttgart and their data center operator is located near Berlin. And then you involved the law enforcement authorities in Stuttgart who said, well, but the crime scene, typically German, is actually in Berlin because that's where their data center is and it happened on their servers. Then the Berlin colleagues say, no, we are not responsible here because the actual crime scene is the company. And then you always see this back and forth, this ping pong. And then you might have a good cybercrime unit in that federal state, like a center or central office for cybercrime, which in some federal states works really, really well, but in some states doesn't work at all with the local police authorities. There are indeed also significant differences there. And I think that's where we have a little bit of a bottleneck problem, because we are simply trying to apply our standard laws or our standard structure to cyberspace. And that just doesn't work.
Exactly. The key word is digitalization. Digitalization is not about implementing an analog process digitally. So if I used to submit the paper form PUJAIC and now submit the paper form as a PDF and then ideally print it out again to process it further in the office, something is fundamentally wrong. And we still have an incredible amount of catching up to do in many areas in Germany. It's really about time that digitalization first leads to action and not just announcements.
How do you see the topic of the world order, which is being discussed more and more frequently with the major world powers like the USA, China, and Russia, who are now positioning themselves significantly in the geopolitical arena, especially concerning cyber issues? Do you believe that in the future, the part of the world order or the leader of the world order will be the one that does as much as possible in the cyber realm?
I firmly believe that because if you look at the possibilities that exist in my lecture on network security, cybersecurity, I always use a 3-stage model to show what can be done. At the very bottom are the known vulnerabilities, and as already mentioned with WannaCry, the damage that can occur there, even at that level, up to the very top, if one is able to manipulate standards and standardization processes, as we have seen, for example, with dual elliptic curve cryptography, which was once a NIST standard and where a mathematical backdoor was built in. And if I now reflect this on the hardware and all these things where we have an incredible number of dependencies with the networking of everything, which is also necessary because with the increase in population, climate development, and everything, we are simply forced to make everything more efficient and better networked. And I like the examples from John Deere in America, the large agricultural machinery manufacturer, how they connect future IoT ARM technology directly to sensors in the field via satellites, and the machine is then precisely controlled to use a minimal amount of fertilizer and such. In this way, millions of gallons of fertilizer can be saved. And you can see there is a compulsion there. It continues to move in that direction for economic reasons. And we are increasingly losing control, a sign or grip on the cybersecurity of all these things that are developing ever faster, while other countries have a much better handle on it. In different positions, often due to historical growth and economic development. Therefore, my assessment is that cyberspace will play an even greater role in a very short time than it already does at the moment.
Do you think the issue of transparency is important to best manage geopolitical crises? I always give a different example which has nothing to do with geopolitical issues, but specifically here in Germany. Time and again, the press tears apart the next company that has been hacked or the next district or whatever. I am someone who says even from the beginning, stop using fear as a selling point, because fear does one thing. It makes people switch off and say, okay, what am I supposed to do now? I'm always the next one. I can't do anything about it anyway. But especially now in cyberspace, I notice again and again that collaboration has indeed become stronger. Also, I would say among countries and security agencies. But in the end, the so-called ordinary citizen actually notices little of it, more so when something has happened. Do you also see a bit of a chance there that if we were to move more towards transparency, we could perhaps do more against geopolitical crises or potentially better raise awareness about such crises?
Basically, I would definitely say yes. Much of the fear, etc. In cyberspace, there is naturally also ignorance, because you always have this fog, especially when it comes to offensive capabilities and such. No one ever wants to say anything about it, where if you look into in details, you can very well sort out where certain capabilities might be visible. If you approach it a bit more openly so that you really say, yes, what is actually the risk, then I can handle it a bit better as a defender. And maybe it also gives me a better idea of whom I need to focus on, where there is really a risk factor. So I think it would make dealing with it easier. And when you look at drastic examples, like NordPetya back then and Maersk, where the company was really lucky that a data center in Africa was offline for maintenance, and that's the only reason the AD wasn't completely deleted. They were very transparent in their analysis to really share the lessons learned with other companies and so on. And I believe that is exactly the right approach. Of course, I can't always disclose everything, but dealing with the incidents in an honest and more transparent way would be much more helpful to learn from mistakes. Because why do we keep making the same mistakes over and over again in every place? And the districts, as you mentioned, are a good example. So if I handle the information much better, I do think that would be helpful, not only locally, but especially in this ever faster and unpredictable geopolitical development that we have globally.
What would you personally wish for in German defense policy or generally in the cyber realm? What should be changed or what should be done differently?
I think a lot has been done well and is effective. From the political guidelines themselves, speaking personally, I find them okay. I find the areas difficult where you have the transitions. So now from the peace phase, where we have to discuss whether we are really still in the peace phase when we constantly have Russia's hybrid activities from the sea cables to other explosions up to X, or in which phase are we actually? And then we clearly have everything legally regulated with the transition to the emergency case. But even here, is it really reflected properly in the cyber realm? Can we manage the transitions like this? With the example just mentioned, when does the Bundeswehr have additional powers? In the traditional environment, it's simple. When the military police are allowed to regulate traffic to somehow protect the Bundeswehr convoy, then they just go out and do it. But when I have critical infrastructures in the cyber realm and I'm again faced with the problem of who is actually responsible for the case, who handles it, and what the communication relationships are, as I said, in practice, we are working on improving this continuously, but we definitely need to pay close attention to it. Is everything running smoothly, and how do we actually need to deal with the hybrid situation that we are already in today?
Now comes my favorite topic, as I often say in the episodes, because it affects all of us. How do you see the topic of geopolitical crises in relation to AI technologies? How will geopolitical crises change with AI?
That's exciting. It was impressive to witness how NVIDIA's stock prices developed after a Chinese model was released. Then the discussions were intense again about how good or bad it is, and ultimately, the role of AI and having a leadership role in that will be essential for the cybersecurity, quite simply. We had a great example when we had our think tank event High Sprint last week. I did the cyber track where there was a demonstration by someone from Ukraine again, based on large language models, multi-agent systems, where you basically, without technical knowledge, just input a few suitable lines. Okay, I want to scan this and that system. Then you look on the internet for an available vulnerability, put together an attack and execute it. And then the system builds everything together, downloads the virtual machines, sets them up, and then it starts. And that means this is today's technology, and it means I am continuously accelerating the attacker. While on the defense side, we are trying to do the same, but system complexity again. The DAPA already tried with the Cyber Grand Challenge in 2016. Yes, my systems defend themselves. I detect the attacker, patch against it. That worked quite well, but only with very, very simple systems that do not represent a full-blown operating system like we have today. And now jump to today, 2025, and the systems are still not capable of really doing that. But we are currently getting more and more elements in the toolbox with AI-based methods to achieve this. And if we really want to take a step forward and defend ourselves against this threat, this incredibly rapidly increasing threat from such autonomous automated attacks, then it can only be done by raising the defense to this level. And in this context, having the knowledge to ensure that no one can give me a manipulated model or has control over it, or simply cuts off the resources when a crisis occurs, is essential.
Therefore, I consider the geopolitical role in the further development and security of cyberspace to be central. What I also observe repeatedly, especially in relation to Ukraine, is that AI and drones are actually the next topics we need to think more about. We see, particularly in Ukraine, that a drone operates on a completely different level compared to the traditional warfare we had without drones, and it plays a very significant role.
We need to reflect on that in the future as well. I always thought, yes, we need to act a bit. We are a strategic command thinking 20 years ahead, which is incredibly difficult, if not almost impossible in cyberspace due to the speed of developments. But things continue to evolve. So how should this area be viewed? And not always focus everything on one element just because it is currently central. And in this case, when you look at drones, how are the defense capabilities evolving through drones themselves, but also through laser technology and more systems? Ukraine itself has now also developed lasers to counter such systems. How do I refine the technology so that I can combat large drone swarms in a short time? How can that turn the tide again? And in this case, we're also talking about quantum technologies by entangling the light particles of my laser beam, which is also more intense. So there's still room for improvement in what can be done with the technology. And we need to look at the overall picture. How is it developing further? And I think we still leave some areas too much out of our thinking. We still find them too abstract, even though they are developing very quickly. Brain-machine interface, not just what Musk has done with Neuralink, but for example, I think there's a really great Australian startup that has developed a processor based on human brain cells. And they have advanced to the point where these brain cells now live for 3 months. And these processors are very energy efficient. And all these systems, all the bioinformatics things, we will come to such developments in the future. I am concerned about how things are developing, especially from a geopolitical perspective, when I look at what countries like China and Russia are doing, which probably don't have the same ethical standards as we do. And and in how do we deal with these things? What do we want? What do we not want? But what responses do we generate to the things that others will do and we reject? And that will be very exciting in the coming years. And let's see how it develops.
Now, for me, the last question, which is also a bit provocative, but it also highlights the current topics again. Where do you see the future role of NATO and the EU, especially concerning this topic?
I hope that the EU will significantly strengthen itself. We certainly have quite a few challenges with the numerous countries and what is happening internally in some of them. My hope is that the signs of the times are truly recognized also in Germany when the new government comes in, that it will be pragmatic and not get caught up in petty squabbles, because time is really running out for us, especially in cyberspace. Europe has weight in the world when it works together, but not with individual countries. One simply has to be realistic about that. We don't have the technologies, we don't have the footprint. We can launch nice programs and make optimizations on a micrometer scale. But it is simply utopian to believe that as individual countries, we could just take a big step towards sovereignty, towards new capabilities. If we do this intensively together, then we have a chance. It is difficult to assess how this will actually develop further with the USA. I'm a positive thinking person, believing that it will still run in reasonably sensible ways. But we must be aware that we have to achieve much more on our own because it is simply demanded of us. The USA can no longer finance it even if they wanted to. They simply can't do it anymore. We have to address this, and space is a central element in terms of importance, so that we implement programs which have been well initiated more effectively, pragmatically bringing them into practice, and then the original discussions and such, like when it's company X from country Y but not yet considered and so on, we simply can't afford that anymore. If we could actually get to that point at who it would be very, very effective from my perspective, the skikomat, but it is what it is and it's difficult.
Thank you very much, Robert, for your open and honest manner. I really enjoyed talking to you about this topic. I would say that's it for this episode of Cybersecurity Executive Matters, and we'll hear and see each other next time. See you then.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I was very pleased. Exciting conversation. We could continue like this forever. And I'm looking forward to meeting again. Thank you. Bye.